With GPU prices through the roof due to cryptocurrency mining, many people are forced to look at budget options that haven't been inflated to the moon. Howdy guys, Ponchato here, and today we'll be taking a look at two of those budget graphics card choices, AMD's RX 550 and NVIDIA's GTX 1050. The RX 550 is our most recent release, being introduced back in April of 2017 at a launch price of $80. It runs at a core clock of 1100 MHz, has 2 GB of GDDR5 memory running at 1750 MHz, is equipped with 512 shaders, and runs at a TDP of only 50 watts. The GTX 1050 is a little older, having been released almost 1 year ago in October of 2016 at a launch price of $110. It runs at a core clock of 1354 MHz, has 2 GB of GDDR5 memory running at 1752 MHz, has 640 shaders, and a TDP of 75 watts. Both cards take up 2 slots and have a DVI, HDMI, and DisplayPort jack, and neither one utilizes a 6-pin PCIe power connector, so you can drop these into any old pre-built with no power issues. Now let's look at the benchmarks. First up is Battlefield 1. Since this game was designed with consoles in mind, even entry-level GPUs like the RX 550 and GTX 1050 should be able to handle it pretty well. On low settings, the 550 manages a fairly impressive 79 FPS average, while the 1050 sits at 99. 1% and 0.1% lows for the 550 were actually better than those of the 1050, 44 and 32 versus 29 and 13 respectively. On medium settings, the 550 starts to bog down, 55 FPS average versus the 1050's 76 frames per second. Again, the 550 maintained better lows at 33 and 28 FPS compared to the 1050's 19 and 8 FPS. On high settings, the 550 barely maintains over 30 FPS with lows in the still somewhat acceptable mid-20s. The GTX 1050 still holds a good average frame rate at 53 frames per second, but lows are again a rough 18 and 13 FPS. On ultra settings, the 1050 finally outpaces the 550 at every level. 51 FPS average versus AMD's 30, 30 FPS 1% lows versus 22, and 21 FPS 0.1% lows versus 16. In Battlefield 1, both cards are reasonably playable up to medium or high settings at 1080p. Next, Counter-Strike Global Offensive. This is an esports title, which is exactly what AMD and NVIDIA were aiming for with their budget cards. On low settings, the 550 averages 235 FPS, while the GTX 1050 hits just under 300. 1% and 0.1% lows are 105 and 50 frames per second for the 550, while the 1050 keeps 1% lows at 154 and 0.1% lows at 70 FPS. On medium settings, the 1050 leads with 274 FPS versus the RX 550's 207. 1% lows are similar for both cards, 92 for the 550 and 98 for the 1050. 0.1% lows, however, show a preference for the 550, 44 FPS versus the 1050's 28 FPS. On high settings, the 1050 gets a sizable lead, 191 FPS average versus the 550's 109 FPS. In 1% and 0.1% lows, the 550 falls behind again with 29 and 10 FPS respectively versus the 1050's 51 and 17. Crank up the settings and the 550 starts to falter, but on low and medium settings, the 550 definitely holds its own. Third is Deus Ex Mankind Divided. This is a graphically intensive game and very unforgiving, so these budget cards are going to have some difficulty. On the lowest settings, the 550 only averages 30 FPS with 1% and 0.1% lows at 24. The 1050 holds a much smoother but still not ideal 48 frames per second average, 32 FPS 1% low, and 21 FPS 0.1% lows. On high settings, the 550 drops to an unplayable 20 FPS with lows at 14 and 13 FPS. The 1050, on the other hand, manages a still playable 32 FPS average with lows at 25 and 24 frames per second. On ultra settings, both cards fall apart. The 1050 averages 21 FPS and the 550 averages a mere 12. Lows for the 1050 are 13 and 8 FPS, while the 550 drops below 10. If Deus Ex is the type of game you're interested in playing, these cards are really only good for low settings. Next in line is GTA 5. Since this is another cross-platform game designed for consoles to handle, we can expect reasonable performance even from the RX 550. In fact, at low settings, the 550 performs beautifully. 114 FPS average, 80 FPS 1% lows, and 70 FPS 0.1% lows. The 1050 experiences that weird stuttering effect on low settings, so while its average is a healthy 130 frames per second, the lows drop well under 10 FPS, making it unplayable. On medium settings, the 550 takes a big hit down to 44 FPS average versus the 1050's 75, with 1% and 0.1% lows at 34 and 31 FPS each. The 1050's lows are a much more manageable 55 and 45 FPS. On high settings, the 550 only averages 35 FPS with lows at 28 and 26 FPS. The 1050 is still actually pretty good, 63 FPS average, 47 FPS 1% lows, and an acceptable 33 FPS 0.1% low. The 1050 will keep it playable up to high settings, but even the 550 is alright on low or medium settings in GTA 5. Next, we have Just Cause 3. This is a taxing game which tends to perform better on NVIDIA GPUs, so we should expect a handy victory for the GTX 1050 here. Indeed, on low settings, the 550 averages just under 60 FPS, while the 1050 hits nearly 100. 1% and 0.1% lows for the 550 are 35 and 26 FPS respectively, compared to the 1050's 44 and 40 FPS. Turning it up to medium settings, the 550 actually doesn't take too big of a hit, 53 FPS average, 32 FPS 1% lows, and 25 FPS 0.1% lows. The 1050 drops its average to 85 frames per second with 1% lows at 38 and 0.1% lows at 25. On high settings, both cards start to struggle. The 550 only averages 36 FPS with lows at 22 and 19, while the 1050 keeps a smoother 52 FPS average with 1% lows at 25 FPS, but a pretty awful 8 frame per second 0.1% low. For Just Cause 3, both cards are playable up to medium settings, but take a turn for the worse on high. Next, Overwatch. Being an esports title, this game is meant to be played on a calculator or TV remote, so the 550 and 1050 should fare pretty well. On low settings, the RX 550 averages 115 FPS with very close 1% and 0.1% lows at 199 FPS respectively. That's a good indication for consistent, smooth gameplay. The 1050 holds up a much higher 216 FPS average with 1% lows at 173 and 0.1% lows at 108. On high settings, the 550 averages 82 FPS with lows at 73 and 71, again a good indication for smooth gameplay. The 1050 keeps up a roughly 50% higher average at 125 FPS with lows at 110 and 101 FPS. On Epic, the 550 really struggles, 37 FPS average, 1% lows at 34 FPS, and 0.1% lows at 32 frames per second. The 1050 is still good though, with a 74 FPS average, 63 FPS 1% low, and just under 60 FPS for the 0.1% lows. Based on these results, the 550 is playable for high or very high settings, while the 1050 can max out the games on Epic settings and still keep up 60 frames per second. PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds is our next game in the lineup. It's early access, it's unoptimized, and it doesn't perform that great with really anything. It's still fun though. On very low settings, the 550 averages 39 FPS with 1% lows at 27 and 0.1% lows at 19. The 1050 more than doubles that average at 83 FPS but still has rough lows, 37 FPS 1% and 18 FPS in the 0.1%. On medium settings, the 550 becomes unplayable at 26 FPS average with lows at 17 and 13. The 1050 is still okay with the 53 FPS average but lows down to 22 FPS in the 1% and 10 in the 0.1%. On Ultra, the 550 produces an entertaining slideshow at about 14 frames per second average with lows under 10 FPS. The 1050 is almost playable, 34 FPS average, but both 1% and 0.1% lows are well under 20 frames per second. The RX 550 can kinda handle PUBG on very low settings, but you may run into trouble in combat due to the inconsistent frame rate. The 1050 is good for very low or low settings, but above that, the stuttering becomes a detriment to gameplay. That story may change in the future after optimization patches in the full release, but only time will tell. Last in our gaming lineup is Rocket League. Built for esports with consoles in mind, this game should be good to go even on a very basic GPU like the RX 550. On low settings, the 550 manages an impressive 283 FPS average, 216 FPS 1% low, and 167.1% low. The 1050 is only slightly ahead with a 335 FPS average, 238 FPS 1% low, and actually slightly lower 146 FPS 0.1% low. On medium settings, the 550 still averages a healthy 145 FPS with lows at 112 and 87 FPS. The 1050 hits much higher at 182 FPS average, 147 FPS 1% low, and 115 FPS in the 0.1%. On the highest settings, the 550 is still comfortably playable, 71 FPS average with 1% lows at 53 and 0.1% lows at 42. The 1050 outperforms it considerably at 108 FPS average with both lows above 80 frames per second. For gaming at 1080p and 60 FPS, both cards can readily max out Rocket League. If you're shooting for 120 or 144, medium settings will probably suit you better. Next, we'll look at power consumption and temperatures. Comparing temperatures on GPUs is a little less accurate than CPUs since basically every card has a different cooler. For these cards, I set both fans to 45% speed, the minimum allowable on the GTX 1050, and measured the temperatures in a room at 24 degrees Celsius. Power figures are for the entire test setup and measured from the wall. With the RX 550, the test bench drew 48 watts at idle, and while stress testing with Unigen's Valley, it drew 115 watts from the wall. The GTX 1050 took almost the exact same power at idle, 48 watts from the wall. Under stress testing, however, the power draw was higher at 137 watts. This makes sense since the 1050 has a 25 watt higher TDP. The power draw was 22 watts more, almost identical to the TDP change. As for temperatures, the RX 550 idled at 33 degrees Celsius and under stress testing hit 67. The GTX 1050 identically idled at 33, but hit a slightly higher 71C under load. Take these results with a grain of salt because the coolers are necessarily not identical. Even at the same fan speed, coolers from different manufacturers and different boards could perform dramatically different. From a subjective standpoint, however, both of them were essentially inaudible at the 45% speed I set them to, and neither one had to increase the fan speed above 45%. Finally, we'll look at performance per dollar. For these stats, I take the average and 1% FPS at medium settings for all 8 games in my benchmark suite, get the average of those numbers, and divide by the MSRP of the chip, or the most common price if the market is fluctuating. Always keep in mind that prices could change at any time, but the RX 550 and GTX 1050 have been pretty consistent despite the cryptocurrency mining craze. The RX 550 comes out with just under 1 FPS per dollar average and 0.643 in the 1% lows. The GTX 1050 hits just over 1 FPS per dollar average with a slightly lower 0.591 in the 1% lows. I was actually really surprised by these results. Usually super budget graphics cards like the RX 550 have awful price to performance ratios because they're typically cut down significantly in performance from their entry-level cousins, with only a slight decrease in price. In this case, however, the 550 is very fairly priced. It's about 30% slower than the 1050 and about 30% cheaper. Outside of the budget-restricted gaming crowd, the 550 also has some niche benefits over higher-end cards, specifically power consumption and noise. The 550 draws a maximum of 50 watts from the motherboard with no need for a PCIe power connector. That means you can drop it into basically any pre-built system and not worry about overloading the power supply. The other is that low power means low heat. Small cases with bad airflow are no problem, and for something like a home theater PC, the 550 stays cool even at about 20% fan speed, which is definitely going to be quieter than your CPU cooler or case fans. So, which one should you buy? Really, that depends on your budget. When you're working with tight finances, price to performance is one of the most important factors to look at, and in this case, both cards are nearly identical in that regard. If you're exclusively playing esports like CSGO or Overwatch at 1080p on a 60Hz monitor, an RX 550 is really all you need. If you're playing more demanding games like PUBG or you want to run medium or high settings instead of low, a GTX 1050 will be your best bet. For situations where $30 won't make or break your budget, I'd recommend going for the GTX 1050. That'll give you much more longevity as newer and more demanding games are released, and give you more acceptable performance in the demanding games we have today. Check out the description for links to buy the RX 550 or GTX 1050. If you want to get notified of new videos as soon as they're up, hit subscribe, then click the bell icon to enable notifications. So guys, if you liked this video, hit the like button. If you want to see more, hit subscribe, and if you have any questions about these graphics cards or the benchmarks, leave them in the comments below. Thanks for watching, I hope I helped, and I'll see you in the next video.